Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes you just feel like one choice is better than another, even before you know all the facts, or why some decisions feel harder than others? Well, this new study dives deep into those hidden forces shaping our choices, and it's got some eye-opening findings. At its heart, this research is about decision bias. Think about it like a nudge, a little push in one direction that affects your choices. It's not about being wrong or right, but about a consistent tendency to lean towards one option over another. This can happen in a couple of main ways. Scientists have developed this cool tool called the Diffusion-Decision Model, or DDM for short. It tries to explain how we make decisions. Imagine your brain is like a detective gathering clues. Evidence builds up like little pieces of information until it reaches a certain point, and then boom, a decision is made. The DDM can actually break down where that initial nudge, that bias, comes from. It can tell us if the bias is in how we start gathering evidence, or if it's in how fast and how effectively that evidence gets processed. The problem is, it's super important to set up the computer model the right way to match the type of bias you are looking for. And that is exactly what this paper tackles. Up until now, there wasn't a clear guide on how to use the most popular tool for this, a program called HDDM, to properly study these biases. Researchers might have been setting up their models the wrong way, leading to confusing or incorrect results. This study decided to investigate this using a special environment called dockerHDDM, to really test different ways of setting up these models and see which ones work best. So what are these two types of bias? First, the starting point bias. This is like having a pre-existing feeling or belief that already tilts your decision one way before you even start looking at the evidence. Imagine you are offered two snacks and you generally prefer one over the other, even before tasting them. That preference is your starting point bias. Then Therese drift bias. This happens during the evidence gathering. It is like the clues themselves are being subtly altered, or your brain is working harder to interpret clues that support one side over the other, even if the actual evidence is balanced. Think of it as the detective's desk getting tilted, making paper slide towards one edge. The DDM can model these. For starting point bias, they look at a parameter called Z. For drift bias, they look at something called the Drift Criterion, or DC. Getting these right is key to understanding what's really going on in our heads. Now, how do you get data into these models? The researchers explain two main ways, or coding methods. One is accuracy coding, where you just mark if a response was right or wrong. The other is choice coding, where you mark exactly which option was chosen. They explain that depending on which coding you use, you have to adjust how you interpret the model's findings. They found a big issue with accuracy coding. If you use this method and you're trying to measure starting point bias, the Z parameter doesn't actually tell you much about your preference for a specific option. It becomes about your tendency to be right or wrong in general, which is usually not what you're interested in. As the paper says, the parameter Z under this coding schema should be interpreted as a prior tendency toward correct or incorrect responses, which means it should be of no theoretical interest in most cases. So, it's a big red flag. Choice coding, on the other hand, is better for starting point bias, as it directly relates to choosing option A versus option B. However, the paper points out that neither of these basic coding methods directly captures drift bias very well on their own. To really get things right, especially when the stimulus itself changes what the correct answer is, they introduce a clever technique called parameter flipping. This sounds technical, but it's like looking at the same data from different angles to make sure you understand what each part means. For starting point bias, when using accuracy coding, you might need to flip the Z parameter depending on what the stimulus was. This ensures that a high Z value always means a bias towards option A, no matter what the actual task was. Similarly, for drift bias, when using choice coding, they suggest V flipping, where the V parameter, which represents the evidence accumulation rate, is adjusted. This makes sure V always represents the rate towards the correct option, regardless of which option it is. But when it comes to drift bias specifically, the best way is to directly model the DC parameter. It is a separate dial that specifically measures that consistent bias during the evidence accumulation. The paper strongly advises against just looking at differences in the V parameter to figure out drift bias. stating that indirect approaches can lead to substantially biased estimates and may fail to capture the true underlying drift bias. To prove their point, they ran this awesome simulation study. They created fake data with known biases, both starting point and drift bias, and then tried to model it using all these different HDDM setups. It's like giving a perfect test to different students and seeing who gets the right answers. In the starting point bias tests, they found that models using accuracy coding without any flipping, like the ones labeled BASAC and REGAC, completely failed. Their z-values just hovered around 0.5, meaning they couldn't detect the bias at all. Models that used choice coding but without parameter flipping could see the pattern but gave weird results for the drift rates. But the models that correctly used parameter flipping, either z-flipping or v-flipping, were the winners. They accurately recovered the true starting point biases. And these models also had way better fit scores, meaning they represented the data much better. When it came to drift bias, it was even more stark. The models that tried to guess drift bias indirectly by looking at the drift rates, V in different conditions, really struggled. They showed some patterns but had large errors. The models that modeled V based on specific choices also fell short. Only the models that directly estimated the drift criterion DC labeled stim-coeflip and retro-coeflip were able to accurately recover the true drift biases. The paper says only the two models that directly estimate DC successfully recovered the DC bias pattern. To make sure this wasn't just a computer trick, they reanalyzed real data from another study, one about judging if a line was big or small. This was a classic experiment where they manipulated both starting point bias by changing how often big or small trials appeared, and drift bias by varying the length of the reference line. In this real-world test, the results were super consistent with their simulations. The accuracy coding models failed to capture the starting point bias, just like in the simulations. Models with parameter flipping, though, worked well. They accurately showed how the starting point bias changed when the proportion of big or small trials changed. They even found that their chosen model, which used a flexible regression approach, gave slightly better estimates than the original studies method, thanks to how it handles individual differences. For drift bias in the empirical data, the story was the same. The indirect methods of estimating drift bias just weren't good enough. They showed a general bias but couldn't capture the specific changes caused by the experiment. Again, only the models that directly estimated the drift criterion DC worked, and the paper highlights one specific model. The regression-based one, that was the best. It not only captured the expected biases, but also revealed a subtle, hidden bias that participants had a tendency to lean towards calling things big even when the evidence was ambiguous. This is a brand new finding that wouldn't have been seen with the wrong model setup. So, what's the huge takeaway here? It is that how you set up your model in HDDM matters immensely. If your model setup doesn't match the type of decision bias you're interested in, you might be missing important effects, or worse, misinterpreting what's going on. The researchers offer a super practical 3-step guide for anyone using HDDM. First, make sure your coding method and any parameter flipping align perfectly with what you want to study starting point bias, or drift bias. Don't use accuracy coding for starting point bias and expect meaningful results. For drift bias, always use methods that directly estimate DC. Second, try out multiple ways of setting up your model and compare them. See which one fits the data best and gives you parameters that make theoretical sense. And third, be totally transparent about your methods. Report exactly how you coded your data, what parameters you flipped, and show your model comparison results. This is crucial for making science reproducible. This study is really groundbreaking. It's the first time someone has systematically tested all these different modeling approaches. It proves that using the wrong model isn't just a little mistake. It can lead to completely wrong conclusions about how our brains make decisions. Imagine applying this to understanding things like anxiety, depression, or addiction. Getting the bias modeling wrong could lead to misdiagnosis or ineffective treatments. The fact that they found a new psychological effect in an old dataset just by using a better modeling approach is incredibly powerful. It shows how much we can learn by simply getting our analysis tools, right? This research gives us a clear roadmap. By following these recommendations, researchers can be much more confident that their findings about decision biases are accurate. And while they focus on single biases, they also mention that often both biases can happen at the same time, and their recommended models can handle that too, which is fantastic. This research is a clear call to action for anyone. Using diffusion models, getting your model set up right is not just about technical accuracy. It is about ensuring the psychological insights you gain are real and meaningful. What do you guys think? Have you ever encountered something similar in your own research or everyday decisions where the way you looked at a problem changed everything? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to Rubin's Mind Lab for more science deep dives, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.